everybody, we are just about to get started here. So, you all be willing to quiet down. We'll get started with the next speaker.
Hey!
Perfect. I know, my voice doesn't carry. I don't do that. Thank you though. I'm super excited to welcome Abbie Tuckner to our stage tonight, speaking about React Native, which is something we don't often hear a lot about at this meetup, but it's also a project that's definitely like blowing up in the world of folks who know JavaScript, and simultaneously it's something that I work with on the day-to-day. So whether this is your first experience with React Native, is hearing about it here, or whether you've been writing React Native for a long time, there's going to be, I mean, it's just super, super exciting. So without further ado, Abbie Tuckner.
Hi everyone. As you know, my name is Abbie Tuckner, and I'll be talking about what I've learned from inheriting a React Native application. So in short, I have learned a lot. This was my first time ever doing anything with mobile development. This is also my first time working with React Native. And to give you a little bit of background, in June I was given the opportunity to take over a React Native app that my team had been developing. And at the time I was like, okay, I've never worked with mobile, I've never worked with React Native, I know a little bit of React, but you know what, I'll just go for it. This will be a really good learning experience for me. And so that's what I did. So to start out, React Native apps are all very unique. And I feel like if you do React, you kind of know that. Also, I learned that if you Google unique and look at the images, you get a bunch of really cute little pictures with one unique thing in it that's not like the others. So I kind of capitalized on that for this slide. But I came from Ruby on Rails development, where there are a lot of conventions about how things should be structured, how things should be done. Rails is very opinionated, and it's also a full-fledged framework. React Native is not that. It's a library, and so you bring in a lot of other dependencies on top of that. The developer is free to structure their app however they want to. And sometimes that can be a bad thing, and sometimes that can be a good thing if you are making sure that you're mindful about, is my app going to grow? Do I need to structure my app now even though it's small? Do I need to be smart about how I'm structuring my app so that it can get larger and everything will still fit into a place that makes sense? So my advice is just to go around and try to find examples of React Native apps, read people's blog posts on how they structure their apps, because they're really helpful, and just find what you like. Look for structures that can handle the inevitable growth. And next is to make sure that you're consistent about what you choose. So make sure that you're putting everything in weaknesses, and you should find the one that you think suits your needs the best. So that's something, again, that you should definitely do research around, maybe spin up example applications or whatever. Just try implementing it, see if you like it, that sort of thing. And also refactoring your app, as your app grows, ripping out a navigator and putting in a new one is going to be a huge pain. So it's good to invest a lot of time in picking what you think is the right solution in the beginning. Documentation. So because there are all of these variants in React Native, make sure that you're documenting what you're deciding. With all the different navigators to choose from and all the different ways that you could structure your app, it's helpful to document something like how to add a screen in your application. If you have some sort of custom components that are involved in navigation that are just on your app, it might be useful to a new developer to look at that and just see okay, I need to follow these steps to add a new screen. This way I know about all these different parts of the app. You might want to document why you chose your navigator, why you decided to structure, for the app that I'm working on, we use like containers and indexes. So you have like sort of a container that holds a screen and then all of your components underneath that. And that's kind of how the previous developer chose to do it. And he did write some documentation around that, and I found it pretty helpful. Test on physical devices. So while simulators and emulators are really convenient and easy to spin up, and if you haven't done mobile development, both like Xcode and Android Studio, or I use Genymotion, which is another Android emulator. They offer just, you spin up this virtual device and you can load your app onto it and you can test with it. And simulators and emulators are really great because you can, now with Xcode, the latest version of Xcode, you can spin up multiple simulators at once, so you can have multiple devices running and you can sort of like run your app side by side on a bunch of different phones and see how it behaves on each of those phones without having to own one of those physical devices, right? But the problem with this is that they often act like the devices that they're emulating, but they don't always. So your users, your end user, is never going to touch a simulator or an emulator. They're always going to be running your app on a physical device, which is why it's so important to test your app on physical devices, as many as you can get your hands on. And an example of this is that the previous developer who was working on the project that I am now on, we were using Redux in a way that was slowing down the performance, but it wasn't really noticeable when you were using an emulator because the emulator has a lot of computing power. He actually went out and got a cheap Android phone that was a little bit underpowered, and suddenly it became really apparent that the app was really slow. And so we had to do sort of a refactor of how Redux was used in the app to speed it up. And that's something that you don't really want to happen before you like ship it out to your users, and your users go like, what? Why is this app moving like a snail? Okay, so OS and device behavior discrepancies. This is sort of goes along with the testing on real devices. Oh, there's like a, is it playing? Okay, so this has been like a frustrating issue for me because you'll run into things like where you'll be testing 2 different versions of Android and you'll have a really weird issue only happening on one version of Android. The best thing is when you can reproduce it. For example, like my QA person, she has a version of an Android phone that I don't have like an emulator for it either. And for whatever reason, she's running into this really weird issue and I have no way to reproduce it. And she doesn't work in Minnesota, she's out in California. And so it's just, like you can be running the same version of Android on 2 different phones and you could get a different behavior out of one of those phones. And that's just kind of how it goes sometimes. So yeah, so make sure that you're testing on real devices because there can be a lot of discrepancies in behavior. And one of the solutions that I have thought of for this is writing integration tests. This is where I feel like integration tests would add a lot of value. You don't have that many options for integration tests right now, but there is Appium, which is a cross-platform, it's like a WebDriver, but it's for mobile phones. And so I think there's also one called Espresso, but you can only use it for Android. So if you're using a React Native app, and likely you're developing cross-platform because that's a huge advantage of React Native is that you can develop one app for 2 platforms. But anyway, you can use Appium to write the integration tests, and then with Sauce Labs, you could run those integration tests on their device cloud, which would run all of these integration tests across all of these different devices, so you would get the real device benefit. You wouldn't be running it on emulators or simulators, and you could test all of, like the well-worn paths of your application, and you could just make sure that everything's behaving correctly. And that would save me so much development time just clicking through things over and over and over again, loading up a new simulator, emulator, clicking through things over and over again. To be able to automate that would be amazing, and same for my QA person. Okay, practice TDD if you can. And I am not like a huge stickler on like, make sure you write the test before you write the component or whatever. It's a good thing to practice, and you do feel like super cool when you can do that. But the point is more to make sure that if you're making a feature or something like that, or you're fixing an issue or something like that, make sure that you're writing tests alongside those changes, because it's so much easier to write the tests alongside your software than to scramble to write your tests after you've written everything. Because while you're writing the code, you're like in the mindset, you understand what's going on, and you are like ready to test it. If you go and you look at the whole application and after you've written it and you're like, okay, I gotta write tests for all this stuff now. Like you have to put yourself back into those contexts. You have to go through context switching to go through everything and figure out what it was. This was a problem with the application I was working on. There was definitely a scramble to write tests, and we are not at the test coverage that I would like. But that's something that can be worked on. And also, if you are just joining a team, I always look at the test suite when I start on a new app, because if they have good descriptive tests, then it is literally just something that is describing what's happening in the code, and it goes through all of the different use cases for you. And so either way, it can benefit the project in a lot of different ways. Use CI and Fastlane for automated deployment. So this is a really big thing that I wanted to push when I started on the app, because we were deploying it manually, and I just feel like you can save a lot of development time through automating that process, and you can also save yourself user error. So like if I'm uploading a version to TestFlight and I accidentally use the wrong scheme, so the wrong environment, and I set it up for development, or I set it up for staging instead of like production, or I'm on the wrong branch or something like that, when I compile the app, like all of that is taken out of the equation, and you can just get it up there, and it's great. Fastlane, if you don't know what Fastlane is, it is an awesome tool that is written in Ruby, and it makes automating beta deployments and releases really, really easy. It basically allows you to compile your application on Travis, which is what we use, or any other CI. I think that they integrate with a lot of different ones. But right now, we just compile the app every time that you make a push to GitHub, and that's like what is the check mark. That's the check that we do, is that the app compiles and runs. But we also have it set up so that on certain branches, if you push and it passes, it will go on past the compile step. It will sign your app, and it will deploy it to TestFlight, so that like everybody in your team can test the app and have access to it. And we're currently working on Android right now. Android has proven to be more difficult than iOS, but that's kind of like the general theme of developing with iOS and Android. Android is a little bit trickier to work with. Okay, this is kind of an obvious one, but I feel like if you aren't doing mobile a lot, you might forget about this, but make sure that you're accounting for the keyboard when you're making your views. Like, for example, this is just an example app that I made, but if you have inputs on the bottom of the screen and you press, enter text into one of them, your keyboard would come up and cover up the inputs. And so it's a good idea to make it so that this just like pops up above the keyboard, and it's really easy to do that. I think that there's an API called Keyboard Avoiding View, and you basically just wrap your components in that, and it will just take care of it for you. Make sure that you're using the correct keyboard type. This is kind of one of those polishing details that will make your user experience just a little bit better. There are a lot of different options for the keyboard. For example, the cross-platform ones are like the default alphabetical keyboard, a numeric keyboard, an email keyboard, and a phone pad, which is pretty much the same as the numerical one. For example, like if you're typing in a phone number into an input field, it's kind of annoying to have to like go over to the numbers, like when you could just have the option to have a keypad right there. So here are some examples of them. I think like the first one is the email one. You can see it has the @ sign and the period on it. The next one is just a regular keyboard, and then the next one is the numeric one. iOS has like more fancy ones, like there's a URL one, and there's just like numbers and punctuation, but Android does not have those options. Use autocorrect and auto capitalization wisely. This is another kind of polishing detail. If you're typing into like an email field, it's nice if it doesn't automatically capitalize the first letter, or it doesn't like auto-suggest things that you have to like click out of if you don't want it to type it in for you. And that, again, is pretty easy to do. React Native just has some options on the input elements that you can use. Use return key hints. So the return key on the keyboard is what I'm talking about. And if you haven't noticed with like mobile applications, which I had never really thought about until I started doing this, but you can actually change the text on the little return key on any application. For example, here are some examples of them, like you can do go, next, search, send, or done. Those are the cross-platform examples. So if you have a bunch of fields and you want to skip like to the next one, you can use the next thing, and then it's pretty easy to get it to skip to the next field. You just have to set up some pointers, and it will do that for you. Make sure that you're upgrading regularly. So React Native has a really quick release cycle. They release a new version every month, and it's a lot easier to update regularly than to have to make a huge jump in versions. Because you might run into compatibility issues or whatever, and it's easier to just take care of like one small thing one at a time instead of having to do it all at once and maybe have to refactor something that you could have taken care of a few months ago. Okay. Develop Android and iOS simultaneously. So React Native is mostly cross-platform, and that's why it's really amazing, but you shouldn't assume that if you develop on one platform, you can just flip a switch and it'll automatically perform and look exactly how you want it to look on the other platform. Displays for iOS and Android are different, so you might have to come up with a solution where like the margins are correct and everything looks good on both versions. In some parts of it, you might have to, like for example, I think for our DateTime Picker, we didn't like how it was working on Android, or it just was not working, and so there actually has to be like a Java bridge. Oops, I just like turned off my presenter notes for myself. Oh really? I have no idea what I did. I just moved the mouse.
We're nearly back.
Okay. Okay. I just won't touch like anything except for the arrow keys from now on. Yeah, so basically make sure that you account for both platforms. You never know what small issue will come up on the other one, and again, it's better than getting to the end of it, trying to start on the other one, and then realizing that you have to refactor a bunch of parts of the app because you didn't account for both platforms at the same time. Use console log to cut out extra rendering. So this is a really simple way to increase your performance. You can spend some time just auditing your components to see if they are rendering more than they need to be. And you can do this by using your browser's profiling tools under the Performance tab, like in Chrome. This is my last tip. Use crash reporting, because, I mean, if you release your app, like now what do? You want to have an idea of how it's performing out in the wild. And so there are a few ways that you can do this. A couple services are Crashlytics and Appsy. We use Appsy, and I really, really like it. It shows you like what versions of Android your users are using most, what versions of iOS your users are using most, what devices. And it allows you to monitor what crashes are happening at what frequency. you can watch the adoption rate of your new releases and see like if the crash rate goes up or down as the adoption rate goes up, which is really really nice to see if you release something that has a big fix in it and you see all your crash rates coming down. That's pretty rewarding. So yeah, that is everything. I hope that I have inspired some of you to maybe go out and check out React Native, and if you've been working with React Native, maybe a way to work through some of the pain points that I have definitely run into.
First questions, if it's all right?
Yeah, we're taking questions. In the back?
Do you like it?
It's kind of like a, I'm not really sure. I wouldn't even say like a love-hate relationship. I think that the difficult part of working with React Native has been more the fact that I inherited legacy code. Basically, I inherited code that other people had written, and so getting into understanding what they had written was really tricky. I would say I have more appreciation for React Native actually after putting this talk together, because I just did a lot of research. I read a lot about it. I spun up my own app and just worked on that, and I do think that it is a very cool framework. It makes, I mean, you can spin up an iOS and an Android app in an hour. And get a login page working if you're familiar with React and you've maybe worked with Xcode and an Android emulator before. So I feel like it is very innovative, and I think that the main difficulty is just support for it, and there isn't enough, there aren't enough people doing development on some of the libraries, and I guess that's the main thing right now. But I do think that it has a future in mobile development. Yep.
What sort of other supporting libraries do you
Okay. So you're just wondering about supporting libraries?
Yeah, just other components. Just React Native.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, there are definitely a lot of things that we use, but I would say the main things are you have React Native, and then you have the navigator. So we use React navigation. Not sure what else the main components are. Those are really the big ones, and then everything else on top of it, I would say the testing framework we use is Jest. I'd like to add Appium for integration tests. I mean, I'd really have to look at the app itself, but for the most part, it's pretty much just React code with the React navigation. Chase?
Okay, so let's say that you have a fully functional React app.
Yeah.
Built out, everything's good to go. So how much work and how much of a paradigm shift is it to take a React app from a web browser and turn it into a native app?
I mean, it would be pretty different. I would say that you could probably reuse some components. One thing about React Native is that you don't use HTML. They have all of their own sort of, what would you call that, elements. So you would have to port over all of those. I would say that it would be kind of difficult, just because native is very different from web. There might be some more logistical things that you could keep, maybe keeping reducers, or services or something like that. I feel those could be reusable, but the components themselves with the actual HTML in them and everything, I would say not very reusable. You'd have to rewrite a lot of that.
But a lot of the functions and business logic is pretty sound.
Yeah, yep, I think so. Over there?
So 2.5 years ago, I gave a talk here at PhoneGap. Kevin, who used to run this meetup, used to work for Accelerator. I haven't heard about Xamarin for a while. After working with it for a while, do you think that React Native is just a flavor of the week on this is how we attempt to do sort of it works cross-platform mobile development, or do you think this is legit here to stay and is going to become the long term?
That's a really good question. I don't have experience with any other sort of framework like that, so I can't really compare it with anything. The thing that I think is important about it is that if you are familiar with React, you know Redux, you're familiar with a lot of the JavaScript libraries that are used in React applications, I think that that would be why it would give it some traction, like why it would stick around. So I think that it really depends on the life of React in general that we'll see how long React Native will stick around for.
Another possible way to ask that question is when I was doing PhoneGap 2.5 years ago, it was like obviously broken.
Oh, yeah.
Do you think React Native is obviously broken, or is it like basically good?
I think it's like basically good. I think that like, okay. like anything, you can do it the wrong way and really mess things up. But I think that if you are mindful that you could screw it up and you are making sure, like I said, like that you're documenting things, that you're making solid decisions, that you are testing while you're developing it. Like if you're doing all of those good practices, I think that React Native is actually pretty solid. Yep.
I just wanted to mention something called React Native Web, which is a thing. I think it makes it really easy to take your React Native code and basically just use it as regular HTML on the web.
Okay.
I don't know much about it, but something definitely worth looking at.
Yeah, I have never heard of that, but it sounds really cool. Is there any more questions?
I guess I've got a quick question.
Okay.
Like another big concern about React and the React ecosystem and React Native recently has been the whole
Licensing?
The licensing thing.
Yeah.
So what degree has that factored into like the longevity of apps, of React Native apps? Well, for React, not for React Native.
Yeah, React Native actually has not been switched over to an MIT license yet. It's BSD license. Yeah. Yeah, so honestly, I don't really know that much about it at all. And like, I also wasn't the one who decided to make a React Native app in the first place, but I do think that that is something that you need to take into consideration when you decide that you're going to use the framework, right? It's not MIT. Like, there could be repercussions for that in the future. And that's one thing, that is definitely one strike against it, and that is one reason that you should, like, might be hesitant about using it, is the licensing issue. Yeah.
How much of your code, like, did you, in any case, have to implement some sort of like platform-specific implementation?
Yeah.
Like, how much of, and like, what were like the biggest pain points for platform-specific implementations?
So I haven't actually had to deal with this that much. The dev previous to me sort of dealt with a lot of those things. But the main thing I think for us was like the DateTime Pickers act differently for both. But I would say overall, there isn't much code that differs between the two platforms. Most of it is shared. Yeah, it is really good. Because I know that it took the previous dev, like he had to write a Java bridge or something, and he'd like never written Java before. And he had to do that for like a few weeks. And yeah, I just don't, that doesn't seem very fun to me, but thankfully, that hasn't happened to me yet, and I don't think that we're going to run into too many more problems where that happens. But I mean, we'll see.
Thanks, Abbie.
Thank you.
One more question. I apologize.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask, is there anything like a CSS reset or something like that for between the two systems, like where you kind of like normalize it at any point, or is it all kind of like it overrides it regardless type of thing?
You basically start with like a normalized page already, like.
Well, I mean like the date picker and that sort of thing.
Oh, the
So
date
there's
picker
not
and
a way to,
stuff.
like, override what it's doing naturally, right?
Um,
And like make it do whatever you're trying to get it to do type of thing.
so you mean like writing your own date picker?
I guess, yeah.
I'm not really sure.
Okay.
I know that we like customized it, so like to make it sort of work how we wanted it to, but I don't feel like you have that much control over how it looks or how it behaves.
Sorry.
Oh, don't worry about it. Like.
I think we'll probably take a 4 or 5 minute break and then come back with the last presentation of the evening. No worries. All good. Is this your adapter?
I don't think so. Except for these.
Perfect. Thanks.
Honestly, that was great. Thank you. So yeah, we really
2 seconds.
We didn't really mess up.